Right, this is going to be chapter 3 of the chapter reading of the book Pentagon 9/11 by Alfred Goldberg. And this is going to be part 3 called The First Floor. So, and this is in chapter 2 of the book. So let's get to reading this page. All right, so I'll blow it up just a little bit more so that everybody could read along with it. And here we go. On the first floor of the E ring and part of the D ring, directly in path to the oncoming airliner, the United States Army's Resource Services, Washington RSW office, part of the Office of the Administrative Assistant to the Secretary of the Army, employing 65 to 70 people, managed money and personnel for the headquarters staff. By September 11th, 2 RSW divisions had moved from their older, unrenovated offices to their new IE 400 area workplace. However, the RSW director, longtime government employee Robert Jaworski, and many of his people from the personnel, financial management, and accounting staffs had not yet moved into their new spaces and were still working in the D ring, corridors 6 and 7 area, 500 feet or more removed from their colleagues. In his 3D 735 office, Jaworski heard radio broadcasters of the World Trade Center attacks. After the second airliner hit, Jaworski and his staff realized the crashes were terrorist attacks. He remarked to one staff member visiting from the new E-ring office that the Pentagon would likely be a target. Seconds later, Jaworski heard the building shake and the sound of shattering glass. Instant, staggering confirmation of a speculation. He and his nearby colleagues got up from their desks, moved quickly down corridor 7 to the A ring, then to corridor 9, down the ramp into the concourse, and out an exit leading to south parking. For the RSW staff in the E ring, location determined their fate. Jaworski later observed sorrowfully that they didn't have a chance. Just 2 occupants of one office along the inner side of the part of the E-ring survived, only because they stepped out to the restroom moments before the airliner slammed into the building. None of their immediate office mates escaped. RSW's Program and Budget Division, hit especially hard, lost 25 of its 28 members. Across the E-ring hallway, along the outside wall of the Pentagon, the jet's impact proved almost as lethal. Of the Managerial Accounting Division, 12 members present, only 3 survived. For these 3, the fireball and partial collapse of a wall almost proved their undoing. Not one escaped without injury. All told, 34 of the 40 members of the Pentagon of the Program and Budget and Managerial Accounting Divisions present that morning perished. Among the 6 who survived, Sheila Moody was one of the luckiest. Seated at her desk in IE 472, she heard a whistling sound, and then there was a rumble, and a large gash of air in the fireball that came into the office and just blew everything all over the place and knocked us over. Trapped in a lot of smoke and just darkness, she could not see the hole blown in the outer E-ring wall only a few feet away. Then, in the silence that had descended, she heard the working of a fire extinguisher and a voice calling out. She called back, but then the smoke and the fumes started taking my breath away, and I really couldn't call out to him, so I started clapping my hands. Her rescuer, Staff Sergeant Chris Braham, extinguished the flames between them and led her to the outside. Moody was hospitalized for burns to her hands that proved worse than she initially realized. 2 other survivors from the RSW offices, Juan Cruz Santiago and Louise Kurtz, were less fortunate than Sheila Moody. When the plane hit, Cruz was thrown to his knees, engulfed by fire. Most of his body was scorched with second, third, and fourth-degree burns. Reduced to a state of semi-unconsciousness, he became aware of water being poured over him, and he vaguely perceived someone carrying him out of the building. As the initial shock wore off, he experienced excruciating pain. Hospitalized for 3 months. Cruz underwent nearly 30 surgical procedures, including skin grafts to his face, right arm, hands, and legs. He was left with cruel damage to his face, eyes, and hands. Louise Kurtz was standing at the fax machine in her RSW office when she later recalled she was baked totally. I was like meat when you take it off the grill. In spite of her pain and shock, she managed to crawl on top of a table and through a window to the outside of the E ring. She lapsed into unconsciousness in an ambulance and woke up in the hospital. Doctors gave her a 50% chance of survival. After more than 3 months, she left the hospital without her fingers and her ears, with multiple skin grafts and with other severe disabilities. Another Army office under the Administrative Assistant to the Secretary of the Army, the Information Management Support Center, or IMCN, on the first floor suffered 6 fatalities. Room 1E460 lay in the direct path of the airliner. Its 3 occupants, Michael Selves, Lieutenant Colonel Dean Madison, and John Chata, perished. 3 other IMCN employees, Teddington May, Robert Maxwell, Scott Powell, a contractor, died at other locations occupied by IMCEN in the E ring. More fortunate than her 6 fellow IMCEN employees was Specialist April Gallup. Have we heard that name before? In room 1E517 in Wedge 2. On September 11th, she brought her 2-month-old son, Alicia, to work with her because her babysitter had been hospitalized. With Alicia in a stroller alongside her desk, Gallup sat in front of a computer. And as soon as I was about to turn the computer on, boom, the computer blew. Notice what she says here. As soon as I was about to turn the computer on. Later on, in interviews, she says when she turned on the computer, that's when everything blew up. And she said that she thought she was responsible for blowing up the Pentagon because she turned on a computer and she heard this giant explosion. That's not all. I know the story of April Gallup. The walls and ceiling crumbled, and she found herself covered in debris up to her waist, frantically looking for her son in the smoke-darkened room with flames providing the only light. She saw that the stroller was on fire but empty. Freeing herself from the debris, Gallup searched desperately for her baby and found him covered up in the litter. He's in a ball like that. So I was thinking, oh my God, his bones are broken. 2 of Gallup's office mates, Corporal Eduardo Bruno and Sergeant Roxanne Cruz Cortez, soon came to her aid after freeing themselves from the rubble that had trapped them for a few minutes. They helped her climb over the half-demolished office wall and pass the baby from hand to hand as they moved toward an outside window in the E ring that led to safety. Let me repeat that. They helped her climb over the half-demolished office wall and pass the baby from hand to hand, so they moved toward an outside window in the E ring that led to safety. Now, later on, she modified her story, saying that she left through a hole in the wall, but that she didn't know this because she fainted. And that's how she was helped out. Later on, she would modify that story again. And this time, she said When I left through a hole in the wall, I didn't see any plane debris. Well, she never mentions that she fainted, and she never mentions that she didn't pass through a hole in the wall. She was through an outside window in the E-ring. Followed by perhaps as many 10 civilian workers, Bruno and Cruz Cortez reached the window. Cruz Cortez pushed and pulled two hysterical women to the window. The baby was passed outside and the others followed, dropping one by one. Bruno, although injured and later hospitalized, helped catch people dropping from the window. Once on the outside, Gallup lost consciousness. Well, there you have it. Now, April Gallup would later tell certain people in the Truth Movement that she saw no plane debris anywhere. Now, how would you see anything if you're unconscious? And if you're not going outside of the hole where the impact point was, but instead going through a window, well, certainly you're not going to see any plane debris. When she awoke in George Washington University Hospital, she later called for a baby. Fortunately, he had survived without serious injury. Beyond the Army offices in Wedge 1, the newly opened Navy Command Center, the NCC, occupied a much larger space than the RSW offices between Corridor 4 and the wooden barrier midway between Corridors 4 and 5, including much of the D ring and all of the C ring. Bridging the light well between the D and C rings, the center's area exceeded a third of an acre. The command center tracked movements of U.S. Navy vessels and aircraft and monitored significant international events, keeping the chief of naval operations and other senior Navy leaders informed of important developments. The watch floor, focal point of the NCC, was staffed 24 hours a day. 7 other offices shared the center spaces with the watch floor. 5-foot-high movable partitions separated most of the office cubicles. For meetings, including daily briefings during the work week, a theater and conference room provided larger spaces. Between 50 and 70 people were normally on duty during a workday. Although its near end was some 80 feet from the outer wall of the Pentagon, the NCC had no real protection from the exploding airplane. In a matter of seconds, it became an inferno of explosion, fires, and tangled wreckage that killed or injured most of the occupants. At work in the meteorology and oceanography section of the center on September 11th were the officer in charge and 2 petty officers. Earlier that morning, Lieutenant Nancy McCown, a former chief petty officer, gave a briefing on global weather patterns. After completing the morning briefing, McCown returned to her office, where she and her 2 aerographers, petty officers Edward Earhart and Matthew Flacco, watched as United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower in New York City. Soon after, McCown returned to her own cubicle nearby and sat down. Almost immediately, she heard a roaring crescendo of sound as ceiling tiles came down and she fell from a chair. It felt like an earthquake. She had experienced earthquakes in Japan. And the roar became louder. McCown yelled bomb and dived under her desk. The office plunged into darkness and began to fill with smoke. Within moments, the thunderous din subsided. Smoke thickened. And she emerged from a now deadly quiet office, calling out for her 2 petty officers. There was no response. Only flickering lights overhead illuminated the pitch-black space. Disoriented, McCown walked the wrong way toward the path the jet had taken through the building. Feeling the wall growing hotter, seeing visibility dropping further, and finding breathing more difficult, McCown turned around and headed back toward her office, stopping momentarily under the spray of a broken sprinkler line to ward off the intense heat. On spying a small bright spot in the distance, she moved toward it, eventually recognizing the glass doors at the fourth corridor entrance to the command center. Although the dense smoke choked her, she somehow succeeded in gaining the attention of two rescuers who took her into Corridor 4 and sat her down. Sputtering, McCown told them that we had to go back and get my two guys. She thought that one of the nearby rescuers headed back into the center. As she awaited further assistance, McCown could hear people yelling, "Don't jump! Don't jump!" Looking up, she could see silhouettes falling from the second floor down. I don't know if they were jumpers or falling. All I could actually see was the silhouettes coming down and people kind of reaching up, trying to grab them as they were coming down. After reaching a triage center in North Parking, McCown was transported by ambulance to the nearby Arlington Urgent Care Center, where she was treated for smoke inhalation. Unfortunately, Petty Officers Earhart and Flacco did not survive. Another junior officer in the command center, Lieutenant Kevin Shafer, a 1994 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy who worked in the Strategy and Concepts Office, also watched the attacks on the Twin Towers on the center's large-screen television sets. Shaken, Shafer returned to his cubicle, where he stood and continued to watch over the tops of the partitions. Suddenly, the walls exploded, and the next moment was just a gigantic fireball with obviously a ton of force coming through the space. A huge flash of fire erupted with such force it blew him to the floor. Despite suffering grievous injuries, Shafer never lost consciousness, and his actions remained purposeful. Realizing that his hair and skin were on fire, he rolled around on the floor to put out the flames. In those same few seconds, he wiped his hands to his hair and found it charred. When he managed to stand up, smoke-filled air increasingly irritated his mouth and throat and irritated what he could see. As far as he could tell, no one around him remained alive. Aware that he was badly hurt, and neither hearing nor seeing anyone, he began looking for a way out. Judging that the explosion had come from the E-ring, he crawled in the opposite direction. Piles of blown-out light fixtures, ceiling tiles, ductwork, wiring, and cubicle furniture made the going difficult, and Shafer resorted to crawling under and over these heaps, curting his badly burned hands. Following a zigzag path, he worked his way towards the back of the command center, where he saw a dim light ahead. Gasping from the choking smoke, he crawled through rubble, scaled more piles of wreckage, and finally staggered out into A&E Drive through a hole blown in the C-ring wall. Later, he reckoned it had taken about 5 minutes to crawl the roughly 70 feet to A&E Drive. After receiving on-the-spot first aid, Shafer was transported to the DiLorenzo Clinic in the 8th Corridor, from where he was carried outside on a clerical cart and taken by ambulance to Walter Reed Army Medical Center. His burns were so severe, over 42% of his body, that he was transferred to the Washington Hospital Center, where he underwent many weeks of painful treatment to the intensive care unit. After an ordeal of more than 3 months, he was able to leave the hospital. Having suffered permanent damage to his lungs and to the right side of his body, Lieutenant Shafer was retired on medical disability. In the intelligence plot section, tucked into a corner of the command center in the C-ring, 13 people were present on the morning of September 11th. This area was an SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, a highly secured space containing especially sensitive classified materials. It lay almost 200 feet from the outer E ring wall of the Pentagon and along the course taken by Flight 77. The officer in charge, Commander Dan Schonauer, and 6 coworkers had completed briefing Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence Susan Long and members of her staff about 20 or 30 minutes before the impact. Also, in the intelligence plot that morning were 6 others. Lieutenant Commander Charles Capets, using a computer on the watch floor alongside Lieutenant Megan Humbert, and Petty Officer of the Watch Jason Luhauer, while Petty Officers Stephen Gully and Jesse Polsek and Seaman Sarah Cole worked in the adjoining graphic space. Lieutenant Hillier interrupted a meeting in Schonauer's office to report the second World Trade Center strike. A few minutes later, after returning to his desk, Luhauer heard a kaboom and was thrown to the floor under an adjacent desk. Within seconds of the impact, as the fire intensified and the smoke thickened, Luhauer began to have difficulty breathing. Capets visited the intelligence plot from his office on the 5th floor, was present when the watch officer received information that a hijacked aircraft was heading toward Washington. Thinking that his boss should know, he picked up the phone to call when this thing hit. Like Luhauer, he was flung to the floor of the wrecked office and experienced a fire, heat, smoke, and darkness. After initial confusion and failed efforts to find an exit, Capets saw the beckoning light from the hole blown open in the C-wing office wall to A&E Drive and crawled toward it. Finding the office door jammed shut by the explosion, Luhauer followed Capets, scrambled over a barricade of office equipment, and escaped with him through the same large hole. Not the large hole that Gallup claimed to have escaped through. These people actually escaped through a large hole. Gallup escaped through a window and fainted on the outside. So why would she lie about this later on? The two turned back to pull Humbert to safety through a pile of debris. Capets and Luhauer assisted in frantic rescue efforts that helped survivors get out of the building into an A&E Drive. For Schonauer and his briefing team, there was no escape. The rapid spread of the fire and the deadly smoke quickly killed all of them. Other survivors from the intelligence plot also had a close brush with death. The force of the blast slammed Stephen Gully into a huge copy machine, knocking the wind out of him. Kind of like taking a head-on in football. Gully recalled that my smoothie drink went flying. I actually saw my smoothie fly away from me, which, was kind of surreal. On extracting himself, he scrambled through a hole in the C-ring wall to safety in A&E Drive. Polsek remembered a huge force throwing me from behind, expelling him through the hole into A&E Drive as he was still seated in his chair. Blown off his chair, Cole landed in A&E Drive as well, dazed but only slightly injured. These 3, plus Capets, Luhauer, and Hubert, were the 6 survivors of the 13 intelligence plot occupants. All of the Navy's losses occurred in the command center. 42 military and civilian dead, including 3 contractor employees. The deadly force that ravaged the NCC penetrated the wooden barrier separating Wedge 2 from Wedge 1 and slammed into Defense Intelligence Agency offices where about 70 employees occupied a large space in 1C-535. The remnants of Flight 77 ended the plane's path of death and destruction at the inner wall of the C-ring, adjacent to A&E Drive, claiming 7 victims in 1C-535, members of the DIA program and budget office who must have died immediately. Among the 11 survivors, Paul Gonzalez, a former Navy officer and chief of the office, later related that he could not even describe the sound. And then I got hit from behind by a blast of air and heat. I remember looking and just watching things go flying past me, just flying, and I started flying with them. Although injured and burned, Gonzalez remained alert and sought to find survivors during what he remembered as a chaotic 20 or 25 minutes of frantically seeking an escape route through the thick, choking smoke, which forced the survivors low to the floor. Kathy Cordero in the same office felt a real big gush of wind and a big ball of red-orange fire and felt herself on fire. Gonzalez came to her rescue. With others, they crawled under, over, and through the debris until they emerged to a hole into A&E Drive, from where they were led to the center court. Severely burned, Cordero was taken to a stretcher in North Parking and from there to the Virginia Hospital Center in Arlington, where she woke up 6 days later in the intensive care unit. The ensuing surgery, including skin grafts, kept her in the hospital for more than 3 weeks. Gonzalez, badly hurt and suffering from severe lung damage, was taken to Walter Reed Hospital. He believed that doctors used heroic measures to save him. After 2 weeks, he was able to go home to recuperate. 4 of Gonzalez's colleagues, including Cordero and Christine Morrison, later testified that they owed their lives to his courageous leadership. Christine Morrison gave a singularly striking description of her first fleeting awareness of what happened. Quote, "From the back of the room, there was a heat wave like haze extending from the back of the room up to the ceiling. You could see through it. It was moving. Before I could register or complete that thought, this force hit the room, instantly turning the office into an inferno hell. Everything was falling, flying, and on fire, and there was no escaping it. The swiftness and force had no comparison. My body mass didn't exist, and my body was useless. I was slam dunked backwards into another coworker's cubicle, and a piece of a hot heating and ventilation duct trapped the top half of me. I was stunned, desperately trying to do something. I did not understand what was happening. I felt the heat, and I heard the sizzling of me. My eyes had a front seat to the horror. I couldn't move any part of my body. Everyone in our office area was struggling for breath and life. The majority of the lights went out in an instant. Oxygen disappeared. My lungs felt like they were burning and collapsing. The room filled with overpowering thick gaseous smoke with heavy particles before you could get a chance to take the next breath. Somehow, I was bartering for just one breath of air. I finally managed to stand up. Now, there were reports of bodies being seen sitting in chairs, laying on desks, not burned at all. And when I interviewed the Arlington Command Chief, James Schwartz, he said that when the fireball went through the first floor of the Pentagon, it sucked all the air out. And as you could see by the reading of this testimony from Christine Morrison, that she felt the air escape her body, and that she felt like her lungs were collapsing. But she wasn't near the point of impact, which saved her life. The people near the point of impact had the life sucked out of them if they weren't burned alive. I was barely able to think through what a button and how to do a simple function like unbuttoning each section of my blouse to get some relief from the heat. We would later discover that the blast had shifted the cubicles and blocked 2 of our exits. By then, everyone lost his or her sense of direction, end quote. Morrison finally managed to stand. The heat and the smoke drove her back down to the floor, where she lay for many minutes before she could manage to summon whatever willpower and strength she had left and began crawling. She saw an area ahead that appeared to be lighter. Hearing someone say, "Over here," she went toward the sound. By now barefoot, somehow she managed to navigate the wreckage, finally emerging upright into A&E Drive after more than 20 minutes of horror. Suffering from head lacerations and smoke inhalation, Morrison was sent to the Virginia Hospital Center, where she received treatment in the intensive care unit. A harrowing description of what took place on the first floor. And that ends this chapter. And in the next chapter, we'll be talking about the second floor. Until then, see you in the next video. Thank you for coming on, and have a good weekend, everybody.